Schaeffer died, he said he thought that Schaeffer would not be one of the well-known evangelicals. He said now, almost 30 years later, because Bill just wrote the book, he said he now realizes how wrong he was. That Schaeffer does have that sort of a legacy, but in pockets, not, you can go to many places and nobody would even recognize the name. When Vernon Grounds, who was at, I think he was at Denver at the time, when he heard that Schaeffer died, he said, "My own surmise, however, is that while many current evangelical luminaries will fade into obscure references in church history, Francis Schaeffer will be recognized as a key figure in the 20th century evangelicalism." And that was written a couple of days after Schaeffer's death. And I think Bill, in reflection, is saying this, and Vernon Grounds just realizing the influence that Schaeffer had already, that would probably be extended even into the 21st century. When the title may be a little misleading. I don't want you to think that I have been speaking with Schaeffer through my channel. So it's not that I'm going to do. But I want us to think about how did Schaeffer do his apologetics and what might it look like in today's environment, today's cultural environment, ideological environment, however you want to categorize it. And I think that Schaeffer's view and his approach, though Schaeffer would say he thought there was no one apologetic system that met everybody's need. And so when you read Schaeffer, you will realize that, and I want to put a parenthesis here, I'm not suggesting that he never used these, but if you read Schaeffer's work, you don't find a clearly defined cosmological argument, you don't find a clearly, teleological argument. What we get from Schaeffer is sort of as an approach, as opposed to what I would even call a methodology. How do we approach the unbeliever in our culture? And what the interesting thing is for me, as I've been studying Schaeffer, is that the cultural and ideological context of Schaeffer is very similar to the ideological, philosophical framework or cultural orientation today. Schaeffer worked in Europe during probably maybe the height of existentialism. And what I would suggest is that much that is true of existentialism in its philosophical or its epistemological and ontological orientation is very similar to what we are finding today. Now, I'm going to use the word, it's not a swear word, so you can relax. I'm going to use the word postmodern. I'm going to say I hate the word, but I really don't hate it. But I think it's got a lot of mileage for people who want to write books, particularly evangelicals. And so they've got this boogeyman, and he's called postmodernism. But so if I say that, don't throw anything at me, but just what it signifies today, all right? So I'm going to use that term, having put that caveat there. But the cultural, or philosophical context that Schaeffer worked in is very similar to the very context that we work in. Whether you're in the United States or whether you're in Europe, I would even argue Eastern Europe, Africa, you will be surprised because no longer do ideas follow along geographical boundaries. They don't. The World Wide Web, well, we would have waited years for ideas to travel out of the continent up to the UK and over to the United States. Today, 10 minutes later, they're out there and people are reading. So there really is that kind of an influence. And when I go to Africa, I will hear people want to know, will you talk about this? So it isn't just a Western thing. It's not just something that we recognize ourselves. So then I would argue then that the philosophical context of the 60s and the 70s, the Sartres, the Camus. That's what Schaeffer wrestled with. We have some of his books now in our archives. I haven't had a chance to look at them, but books that Schaeffer wrote that were being written by the existentialists, and he was making comments. Yes, he was working through how does that ideology, what does Christianity say? How do we speak into this more existential? The difference between something what Schaeffer was doing, and though these two men were working approximately at the same time, and what Lewis was doing, Lewis worked pretty much in a growing atheism. And you'd say, well, there's a lot of atheism in Europe too, but what the young people were dealing with in Schaeffer's day was the existentialism. And of course, those are the people who were coming to, L'Abri. So we know that in existentialism, we could get very technical about it and say, well, in existentialism, you know, the idea is that existence precedes essence, and we could talk about that. I don't think it's that profitable here for our view, what we need to talk about. But their view of truth was simply that truth was inside, very much like you might get from somebody like a romantic even, though they were not necessarily, they weren't romantics, they just say there's a similarity there. For them, there is no objective reality. There is no reality external to the mind. That's what we mean by objective reality. You were your own truth maker. That was sort of the idea of existentialism. The view of reality, epistemologically, those pretty much is where the people were, especially the young people, that Schaeffer would engage. Now, you must remember that at that time, most of you were not living then, but some of us were. And during that time, as we know, it wasn't just in Europe, it wasn't just in America. There's a terrible reaction to authority. And we're wondering, I can remember when I was in the military at the time, and I'm wondering, will there be any America when I get out? Because they almost wiped out Trenton, New Jersey, and Chicago, and San Francisco, Paris, Frankfurt. I mean, it was across the United States and Western Europe. And the evangelical church did not know what to do. They had never come up against this. So what they did was they simply drew a circle, barred the doors, and said, we hate all those folks with long hair. And they criticized. Well, they should have criticized what was being done. I'm not saying that. But they had no ministry to this group of people because they didn't know how they thought. Schaeffer did. And, he starts L'Abri in 1955, and in 1960, Time magazine picks up on Schaeffer and says that Schaeffer has this ministry to the European intellectual. And you think in 5 years, Schaeffer kind of rises to that sort of notoriety that Time magazine would notice him. Postmodernity, as I've said, a term that I'm just going to use, not because I think it has a lot of truth behind it, but it has cultural currency, so you'll know what I'm talking about. The view of truth of the postmodernists, people like Richard Rorty, Richard Tarnas, Leoitard, name all that you want to name. The idea is that the view of truth simply being that truth is simply a compliment we pay to an idea for the time being. That truth is like saying here, or it's like saying now. I am here, right? But if I stepped over there, then I would say I'm here, and where I'm staying now would be there. So it was very person-related, time-related, and eventually it would be very community-related. So what the postmodernists had ended up doing was, thinking that truth was the community, and so you have some of the writers during those times that would say, I think of one article where we have this idea that solidarity versus objectivity. everything was about solidarity. That is, everything was about the community. Objectivity had no place. And I must be very careful. I'm talking about objectivity in the real sense of the word. That is, objectivity simply meaning that there is no reality independent of the mind. So the postmodernists, as they were writing, would call themselves, some of them called themselves neo-pragmatist, but they were clearly idealist, or ideist, however you wish to say it. So there's a very much a similarity between what was going on in Schaeffer's day in the intellectual and the general world, and what was going on in our country today. And I say it wasn't just in the academy that this kind of thinking was going on during Schaeffer's time. It was spread down in the street. It had been spread there by young people going to the university and existentialism being taught in the university. So we know, those of us who were living at the time in America, university students, they didn't have to be intellectuals. University students were just against anything that had the mark of authority on it. And do you think that we're much different today? So what I'm saying is there's a great, I'm not saying they're the same, but there's a lot of similarities. And because of that, I think that in particular that Schaeffer has something to say to us in our day. People that we live among today think there's no such thing as a metaphysic, and Richard Tarnas tells us that postmodernity is not a worldview, but it's subversive to every worldview. And you can get some of these statements. They're everything. I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Protestant. There aren't any lines. You can become everything, which means in reality you become nothing. So, thinking about it in that way, I would suggest that, in particular, that Schaeffer's view of ontology, his view of epistemology, how we know, and his view of anthropology shaped his apologetic. Now, many today have picked up on Schaeffer, and they have basically used his language, his terminology. My fear is most of them do not know the underpinnings of that terminology. And why did he speak the way that he spoke? And I'm going to suggest that it is because of his epistemology, of his ontology, and his anthropology. So let me look at his, and I'm just doing this rather briefly, to lay down the what I would call the foundation for Schaeffer's thought, and to understand why did he say this and why did he say that apologetically. Matter of fact, this has kind of taken an interest of mine. I'm hoping, I'm on sabbatical right now, so I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to do our archives. Our school has all of Schaeffer's personal papers and all of his tapes and all of that. So I'm looking to do research and actually maybe write a book on his epistemology, his ontology, his anthropology, and then show how that undergirded and shaped his apologetics. Schaeffer's view of reality, he is what we call a realist. Now, I'm not suggesting that every Christian has to be a realist, though personally I think that's a position that one ought to have. And I would be willing to defend it. I don't just tend to be a realist. I am a card-carrying realist. Schaeffer was a realist. He did believe that there was a reality that was independent of the mind, that it didn't matter whether whether there was somebody to observe me. I existed because I had an independent existence, that is, independent from anybody observing me. And there you can see that he would have come right in conflict with the existentialist. And I would say you'll come in conflict with that today in your culture. This idea that reality is not in the mind, where many people want to locate it. He said because of this, he said what had been given up in the 20th century was the notion of antithesis. and that had to do with his view of reality. And by the way, that squares, some of you read Abraham Kuyper. Abraham Kuyper makes the same claim, of an earlier time, of course. But Schaeffer says one of the things that's been given up, he thought, and I think he was right about it, is in the Western world, in the middle of the 20th century, was this whole idea of antithesis, and which led to the notion of what he calls synthesis. And we don't need to go into that to develop that, just as you understand. And because he was a realist, Schaeffer would say that the truth of Christianity is it's true to what is there. Now, if you read Schaeffer, you'll hear that phrase again and again and again. So he said, you can carry out your intellectual discussion to the end of the discussion, because Christianity is not only true to dogmas, it's not only true to what God has said in the Bible, but it's also true to what is there. And then he said, you'll never fall off the end of the earth. So knowing that, having this sort of sense about the nature of reality, and what did Christianity say about this? Well, Christianity begins in Genesis, does it not? With the notion that God speaks something into existence, and these are objective notions, and that there's a real Adam, there's a real Eve, and there are real animals to name, and they are not just a projection of either God's mind or of Adam's mind. So that, I think, was he was a realist, and his epistemology, I would call him a critical realist. Now, I know that there are some who would say, no, Schaeffer was a presuppositionalist. And I'd say, no. Schaeffer was a critical realist. And I will say something about Schaeffer's view of, he did believe in presuppositions, don't misunderstand me, but he doesn't or didn't believe in them the same way that somebody such as Van Til. I'm not saying one is right, one is wrong, though I have my opinions on that. I'm just saying they held those views of presuppositionalism differently. By being a critical realist, and why do I think he was a critical realist? Well, because he quotes Polanyi, Michael Polanyi, several times in his book on epistemology. Now, critical realism is just simply this notion that there is a reality independent of my mind, but I comprehend it or apprehend that reality through me, the subject, and when I do that, it affects how I interpret the thing that's out there. So Schaeffer, and this is an important thing for Schaeffer, you'll see it in his apologetics. Schaeffer believed that it is possible that he could be wrong. He didn't think he was, but you will see when you look at his apologetics how this notion of critical realism played out in his apologetics. So I'm just going to leave it there, that he was a critical realist. Hopefully that isn't, matter of fact, I could even stop and ask the question, is that comprehensible, what I'm just saying about being a critical realist? It replaces what we normally have thought of in evangelicalism is what I'd call a naive realism, right? That what you see, you get it right every time. Well, I don't get it right every time. Have you ever been wrong about something? Of course, nobody here, but I mean, you could probably think of somebody that you've known that got it wrong about something. Now, we don't get it wrong about the major things, right? But as the life gets more complicated and complex, and we're trying to interpret the world about us, yes, there are some times that we get it wrong. Now, Schaeffer says, I do believe that presuppositions are crucial. But he says, he sees presuppositions as something like beliefs. And he says, for my way of looking at them, presuppositions are not accepted by you unconsciously as a prior condition for your first move of thought. For me, the proper way to get at it is that if you're a thinking person, you decide what set of presuppositions are going to lead to answers to the questions. So in other words, they don't just kind of fall out of the sky when I'm lying in the crib at 3 weeks, 3 days old. Some fairy comes and tucks these presuppositions into my cognitive apparatus, and from that point forward, that's how I have to think. And so Schaeffer believed that presuppositions should be challenged, and that they could be challenged. And of course, he has a high view of Scripture, and he thinks that, yes, God has spoken, right? He is there and he is not silent. He thinks that God has spoken. Schaeffer has, epistemologically, an extremely strong commitment to Scripture. He reads through the Bible twice a year. And much of what Schaeffer, how his thought develops, it develops out of the richness of the biblical text. And sometimes I think that's missed by people who study Schaeffer or pick up a book and you read The God Who Is There. You think, he's just such he's a whiz-bang guy. He just sat out on the back lawn someday and contemplated infinity and had all of these great ideas. The fact of the matter is, and Schaeffer would say this in his writings, and that it is through this very systematic understanding and reading of the Bible, to get the flow of history, he would say, to understand how does this God work in a created reality? How do we understand the world in which we live? And he said, well, Scripture gives us the clues about how we are to understand the world in which we live. He says also that when we are his anthropology, and this shocks people sometimes when I teach this students of the more, and I'm not here to discuss theological positions. If you're of the Reformed tradition, God bless you. If you are of the Libertarian position, God bless you. If you're somewhere in between, God bless you. And if you don't know where you are, God bless you. So I think I've blessed everybody, okay? So we're just going to go on. But my more Reformed students really kind of struggle when Schaeffer says, he says, perhaps you don't like the word nobility, but whatever word you choose, there is something great about man. I want to add here that evangelicals have often made a serious mistake by equating the fact that man is lost and under God's judgment with the idea that man is nothing, that he is a zero. And that's not what the Bible says, Schaeffer went on to say. There is something great about man, and we have perhaps lost our greatest opportunity of evangelism in our generation for not insisting that it is the Bible that explains why man is great. Now that's an interesting view anthropologically. Okay? He holds on one hand, he holds very strongly to depravity. He holds very strongly to the view that man is fallen. On the other hand, he holds that there's something great about man, even in his fallenness. And Schaeffer said, it is only Christianity that can help us to understand and explain why is it that man is both cruel and yet he can also do so many good things. He said, well, only Christianity. He's cruel because he's a fallen being, but he can do many good things because he's still in the image of God. So that shaped how he was going to see the person in front of him. Schaeffer thought that was simply the logic of the image of God in man. Now, I would pause here to say, Schaeffer did not work these things out in a very robust way. And those of us who want to follow this line of thinking need to do more work on this, all right? But that was not what Schaeffer was up to. He doesn't really make any argument for this. He just makes a claim. And he makes a claim, that's what the Bible says, and my logical extension of you being made in the image of God, this is what I'm going to say. So I would argue we'll probably have something to have to say about that. He thought there was a unity to humanity, which I think is right, Acts chapter 17, verse 26. And he said, therefore, when we speak to somebody, we speak with humanity, not at humanity. And this idea that when you have a person in front of you, this now shows you how his anthropology shapes his apologetic. He said, when you see somebody in front of you, do not see a sinner first. What you want to see is a human being. And he would say, a human being, that something you have common with. You too are a human being. And it was that enabled Schaeffer to enter into the struggles, the fears, the troubles of the person in front of him. He could really empathize. Now, people said he loved the individual. I'm not sure we could go that far. What Schaeffer did is he had a love for humanity. And he had love for humanity because he was made in the image of God. And so he saw that person in front of him as a human being. And that, we often see the person in front of me, are you Christian or non-Christian? And once we find out they're non-Christian, well, what's the job to do? Well, it's to give them the gospel and make sure that we get a confession so that we can go back to our church on Wednesday night and report that we brought one into the kingdom. Now, I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't want to give the gospel. But I do think it changes the way we enter into our conversation with the unbeliever, if we see it this way. And I think that's something that we learn from Schaeffer. We also would learn it from Lewis. If you've read much of Lewis, it's an interesting comparison to do Lewis and Schaeffer, lived in different locations, dealing with different issues. And because of his view of humanity, and here we see a difference between Schaeffer and Lewis, because of his view of humanity, Schaeffer thought that there were certain things that could not be explained apart from the Christian view of man. Lewis will take that in a different direction, and I think a quite profitable direction myself, and say that because we are humanity, and because we were made for the garden, and a perfect environment, that we all have certain longings, certain desires. So Lewis takes it in that direction. You don't find that much doing that in Schaeffer. Schaeffer takes it another direction. Schaeffer's point, and most of you would already know this, you've read enough of Schaeffer. Schaeffer's pre-evangelism was what he said to take off the roof. By the way, I'm not sure who used that term first. Lewis uses the term. Lewis uses the term pre-evangelism. And I'm not suggesting that somehow Schaeffer read Lewis and used that term. I think they probably just two good minds came up with the same term. And Schaeffer thought that pre-evangelism, and here's where I would believe that Schaeffer speaks to us today in how we reach our community. Schaeffer says, the truth that we first let in is not some dogmatic statement of the truth of the scriptures, but the truth of the external world and the truth of what man is himself. Now see, Lewis would look more to what man is internally, the desires, the hopes, the search for meaning. Although, on the other hand, he would say that Schaeffer would say more of the external needs. He said, this is what shows him his need. And then the scriptures show him the real nature of his lostness. So Schaeffer says, everybody's going to live in this world, right? And you live in the same world that I live in. And you don't create your own reality as much as you might like to. So there's a reality out here that everybody bumps into. And you've got to figure out, how do you make it through this world, right, with this reality that's out here? And Schaeffer's thought was that men developed this idea and ways of negotiating their world, but he was quite confident that if in fact it wasn't built on a Christian worldview, that sooner or later you would come up against reality in a hard way. Lewis says the same thing. Lewis says, you may deceive yourself, but in time, reality will straighten you out, right? And, you learned that growing up as a child, and your mother told you that would happen, and it does seem to be a fact of life. So, Schaeffer thinks that we begin the conversation with the idea of reality. Now, why would that be so important? Well, I will think I should say just a little bit thing and then say, how does this work out in his apologetic? If we are living in a culture that, and there's much more to this than what I would say, I could talk to you philosophically where our culture is. Cultural philosophy, which has this idea that you are the master, right? And you're led to believe that because of a lot of things like virtual reality and social media. You get to control. If you don't like this, you just simply go and do something else. So this has really been reinforced in our lives. But Schaeffer would say, but sooner or later, you've got to step out, so to speak, behind the screen. Sooner or later, the world is going to confront you with its reality. His thought was, our task as evangelicals was to help people see where their line of thinking, where their worldview would lead, and whether or not it would enable them to successfully negotiate this world. So, the first move for Schaeffer was that communication must be open for discussion. Now, so many of us think we get an unbeliever and what do we need to do? Well, it's kind of the dump truck mentality. Back up, let them know everything we know, and say, there, you've got it, now what are you going to do with it? And they're just kind of blinking and, like a deer caught in the headlights, and they don't really know what to do with it. But we've done our task, right? We have given them the gospel. Now, I don't want to make light of giving the gospel, please understand. But for Schaeffer, it would begin with a conversation. And the conversation, in his idea, had to be open. And the one thing that I believe, I should have said that, I've said one thing several times now, so this is probably about the fifth thing that's important about Schaeffer, is that what he did was not simply for intellectuals. I look at many of our apologetics today, and there is a place for what I'm going to say. That is, how many people that are sitting in the church can go out and do battle with the biologist and develop a whole discussion, an apologetic from irreducible complexity? Well, see, most cannot do that. What Schaeffer hands us is something that every person can do. It doesn't, I'm not saying you're not geniuses. I'm just saying you don't have to be a genius in order to do this. That discussion for Schaeffer was not simply intellectual. What amazes me is that I remember talking with Udo Mittelmann, and Udo was telling me about how he came to Christ at L'Abri. I thought, oh boy, he had conversation with Schaeffer. No, he didn't. Schaeffer wasn't even there. It was just workers that was doing the same thing that Schaeffer was doing. And when Schaeffer finally came back to L'Abri, I think he was in the States at the time, Udo had already come to Christ. So we think, well, that's what Schaeffer did. He was a high-powered intellectual. What he formed could only be done by high-powered intellectuals, but that simply is not the case. And it's not merely an academic work. It's profoundly Christian. Truth for him was not just something we talked about. I've been concerned that evangelicals sometimes, I think, are more concerned about truth as something to talk about than it is to live. For Schaeffer, truth was something to live. And if you've ever read True Spirituality, Schaeffer would tell you how he really struggled to work through what does it mean to be a Christian. What does it mean to be in Christ? What does it mean to be indwelt by God the Holy Spirit? Those things really shaped the way that Schaeffer did his work. And he thought that you allow a person to follow the logic of their own position. So he would just simply ask questions. If that's true, then what would this be? One of the things that we have in the archives is that we have the tapes of the Saturday night or Friday night conversations that Schaeffer had at L'Abri. He would come down to the living room or wherever, and he would sit down in his chair and he'd simply say, what are we going to talk about tonight? And there would be people from all sorts of philosophical, cultural, sociological positions. So I'm really kind of interested to see how was he answering those questions that were coming from so many different perspectives. So he would listen carefully, and he listened carefully in such a way that it gave the impression, I don't mean this to be deceptive, that he would concede a point if it could be demonstrated that the point made was superior to Christianity. He really believed that. There was an authenticity to the way he listened. Most of us listen to the unbeliever, just letting them get their thing out of the way so we can get on with the business. And then we began to answer questions that nobody's asking. But Schaeffer listened that carefully, so that he really understood what was it that this individual needed. Where was the pinch point, so to speak, in their thinking? And because of this, Schaeffer gives this evidence of true humility, something that I long to see in the evangelical world, especially amongst apologists, but even Christians. I was speaking to a group in Washington, D.C., a group from 3 of the major universities there, and I remember one lady, young lady, stood up and she said, you know what I really got against you Christians? And I thought, well, gosh, I could probably give you at least 8 reasons, but what do you have? And she said, you are so arrogant. And I said, going to have a hard job denying that, right? We are epistemologically arrogant. Schaeffer wasn't. Did that mean he didn't have a conviction? No. He knew where he stood, but he honestly listened, and because of that, people thought he was really listening to them. And then that built this sense of integrity in the process. He thought that because he worked against reality, I think another advantage of this is the way Schaeffer did it, and I think we can do it, is if you work against the reality, same reality for all of us, he used that as sort of the leverage to which he helped people think. So it now becomes not my beliefs against the other person's belief. It just simply comes that person's belief comes up against the reality in which we live. So it's not my belief banging heads, my belief is better than your belief. Now, at some point in time, of course, we have to do that, right? We have to show, if I say, the superiority of Christianity. But Schaeffer would begin in his pre-evangelism by letting this individual's belief come up against the reality. And he believed man was made in the image of God, and that this was a creation that was made by God, and hence he wasn't challenging a person saying, you've got to come over here and believe what I believe. First, he let them see their beliefs did not square with the world in which they lived. And that's what he referred to as taking off the roof. He thought love and compassion ought to be used. He thought, oh, you do this sort of thing, it's not a game, it's not a methodology. It was something that took the unbeliever seriously, and he really did take unbelievers seriously. He thought there was something wonderful about humanity, even in its fallen state. He emphasized a love for individuals, for the human being, and as I said, he had an epistemological humanity that really opened up honest dialogue between the unbeliever and the believer. And talking, maybe you have, to people who actually did come to Christ under Schaeffer's ministry. And I think of one lady that I interviewed, and she goes through the process with me. What was it like to have, so one day we take a walk in the mountains, and Schaeffer's making this person think through the logic of, in this case it happened to be her position. And she said at the end of the walk, I just realized, yeah, I had a decision to make here. So it's something that, as I said, that's something that we do in love. It opens up true dialogue it has a humility to it. It respects the humanity that's in this person, that everybody has a mind, and that they have their own thoughts, their own fears, their own dream, and they're not stupid. You know, just because a person disagrees with us doesn't mean that they're not intellectually with it. And we assume that they haven't really thought through, that's so stupid, how could you believe that? Well, have you ever believed something stupid? I mean, no heartwarming testimonials, please, right? We all have. But did we believe something just because we wanted to look stupid? Of course not. And I think there needs to be a recalibration of how evangelicals view the unbeliever, much in the same way that Schaeffer did. It allows the non-believer to see for himself the logic of his position. How many times have we witnessed to somebody and we assumed where that person was philosophically, and so we kept hammering on that, and the person said, no, I don't believe that. Well, we just keep hammering away. Because why? Well, those are the things we know. So, don't mess up my dialogue with you. It's a monologue. I want you to, you need to know this. Well, no, I don't disagree with you here. Well, I don't think you really understand what I'm saying. Well, really being able to let the individual see the logic of their own position. We can't force people into this. Why should anybody believe that you're right just because you say you're right? What makes your position right? Now, I do believe my position is right, of course. You'd be silly if you didn't believe it was right. I'd want to take you to a psychiatrist if you didn't believe that your position was right. But you must grant someone else the same privilege. And then say, okay, this is what you believe. Then let's just go through. Where would this lead you? Well, so you say this. Well, how would this answer that? And that's how Schaeffer would lead people. But of course, that takes time, doesn't it? It has to, and as we say, often builds relationship. It places the non-believer's beliefs against the reality, not against my belief. Now, certainly Schaeffer was not ashamed to eventually bring his belief to the table, but he does that after he does this, what has been called the pre-evangelism. It speaks the gospel in a way that not only sees man as a sinner, but places the gospel in the larger context of reality, that here we have a person made in the image of God. I don't know that we pick up everything that Schaeffer said or did. What I'm trying to do is to have us think about, how do we view the world in which we live? How do we think about how people know what they know? What do we think about man is? Okay? And then let that shape how we engage the unbeliever. How do we engage those who live in our culture, who live quite radically differently than we do? I mean, people who have lifestyles that are, quite frankly, rather offensive to us, right? You don't have to go far to find that. And it's difficult sometimes to set that aside and be able to treat this person as a human being. And if you know how the things that would go on at L'Abri, and Schaeffer never made an issue of those things when you think of all the different kinds that came. So just a little something for us to think about, and to how might we deal. And I've not dealt with the particulars. I just tried to give you some underpinnings for how Schaeffer viewed reality, how he viewed this idea of knowledge, how he views the man himself, and then how does he think we engage this person? Does that shape? We say, I've seen it so many times. Somebody says, well, why would you come to me? Say, well, why would you want to come to me? Well, because we love you. Oh, why do you love me? Well, because you're made in the image of God. Okay. And so now we've given our spiel. And then we say, get right to the gospel. Okay. And the person, I don't want anything to do with that. And we walk away. And we never come back again. We really love them. They really were important because they were made in the... No, they weren't. It was I think it's a trick that we often use. Shame on us. And we use that to make us look something other than what we really are. Now, I'm not saying that's the case every time. I fear it's too much the case too often.